Okay, we're going to kick off right on time. We got 4 speakers and time for questions and conversation at the end. Okay, so the topic of this panel is looking at how we can best leverage and respond to our museum visitors' social media photos. And there's a number of questions that sit underneath that. What technological solutions can we use to perhaps ingest them as a data set and analyse them for insights? How can we best respond to our audiences in an informed way, learning from those insights? And what exactly motivates our users or our audiences, visitors, to take photographs when visiting the museum and post it to social media? So to help us outline this topic, we have this blueprint or user journey. It's a combination, and it's not really a topic, it's a journey, and it's an idealized journey. I would say that this service structure doesn't exist, or I know that this service structure does not exist in any one institution. Portions of it might exist in some, and in this, the photograph is like an ambiguous post-it note, an ambiguous message that as it moves deeper into the museum, it affects new processes and influence as it does. Where are my notes? So to unpack this a little, we have the visitor's space where the social media photograph is out in the wild in the top 2 levels, where the visitor is experiencing the museum and posts an image to social media. That platform hosts it as well as the conversation around it. Moving down to the Muse Tech level, we have museum technology which could potentially ingest all those images as a data set and perhaps make linkages to our collections. And the next layer down, our Muse Social level, our museum social media manager, is during that process, interacting with that visitor on the social media platform, or engaging more broadly. We could consider it as 2 audience groups and communities. So in that sense, this diagram is scalable. And of course, the social media manager would partake in analysing the data set, finding insights, and working with museum education to reflect those insights in programming. And that, of course, comes out as a response. So down the bottom, we have photos going into the museum and then starting to come out. And as you move across the diagram, you can see the process starts to overlap. And of course, that overlapping, that round robin effect, starts to build up a relationship between the museum and an audience. And it repeats and repeats until one might ask the question, what comes first in visitor engagement on social media, the museum or the visitor? So to unpack those first 2 rows, we have Jenny Kidd. She's come across from Cardiff University, and she specialises in digital media and creative economies. So over to you, Jenny.
Thank you. Could I please get my document? Okay, so firstly, thank you to Alli for asking me to be a part of this panel. I'm really thrilled to be here, and I'm learning a huge amount. I've come over from Wales, from Cardiff University, where I do a lot of research with museums and digital media, focusing especially on issues, I would say, of digital museum ethics, working closely with institutions like the National Museum of Wales, Tate, and also Tower of London, other institutions. I'm happy to talk more about that work. And Alli has tasked me with the job of talking a little bit about kind of broader media theory and what that tells us about the use value of social photography. So I'm taking up that mantle. I'm going to do it in a manner that hopefully won't send you to sleep. This is also a part of my remit, I think. Okay, so we all know here in this room that social photography, so here we're talking then about photos that are taken with smart devices and that are shared through multiple different kinds of networks, but perhaps especially through social networks. We know that that's a big deal in 2016, and we've heard a lot about it at other sessions at the conference here. I want to kind of, start by just talking a little bit about what we might mean when we talk about a social photo. And I am going to do that, and in the backdrop you're going to see a number of different images of social photography that all come from, I should note, the Welcome Collection in the UK. Yeah, whoop, to Russell there. Who's been primed for this. And specifically, they come from the States of Mind exhibition that they had recently, and the installation, the art installation Yellow, Blue, Pink, which was an incredible art installation. And of course, the moment that people entered into that space and entered into that environment, and you can see it on the screen there, their immediate response to being in that environment was to start taking photos of one another and to start, of course, taking photos of themselves and sharing them via social media. So I'm going to use a number of those different images from that encounter. And I kind of want to use those images as a way of kind of forcing us to consider social photography and not just the selfie. And we talk a lot about the museum selfie, and we're very familiar with what that looks like, but maybe to kind of, broaden out a little bit. But of course, the most pervasive form of social photography, we might note, is probably the selfie. And a number of people have sought to unpack what that might mean, what the implications of the selfie might be within museum contexts. Alli Burness has written about this in a really interesting essay called New Ways of Seeing, which is freely available online. I encourage you to read it. And in that, she talks about the ways in which, we might envisage the use value of social photography within museums, and refers to the ways in which we use the selfie, especially for identity construction. We are all used to the idea that in different kinds of social networking spaces, we might use different kinds of social photography to speak to who we are within those spaces. So the photos that I would use in LinkedIn might differ quite spectacularly from the photos that I would use in a space like Facebook or indeed in Instagram. So we're all very familiar with that. But, and as Alli has noted, social photography, and particularly the selfie, is a kind of quite stubbornly ambiguous thing. It's difficult to read. And there's more work to be done, I think, to understand the kind of phenomena of the museum selfie in particular. So we might ask questions like, what kinds of selves are created within that kind of a format? Indeed, what kinds of museums are being created? Does a social photo represent a new opportunity for a museum user to perform their visitation? And if so, what kind of a performance is that? It's easy to dismiss social photography as being trite and narcissistic. We will be very aware of the press reporting in particular around the selfie and how dismissive it is of that kind of practice. But research is starting to unpack a number of other ways that we might understand the use value of social photography. And so here, this is my kind of my most wordy slide that I have here, and I apologize for it, but there's a lot of information on there which I'll unpack. So there are a number of other ways that we might start to understand then the use value of social photography. So sometimes, never inevitably, but sometimes we might understand social photography as being a performance of power. Say in the kinds of selfies that feminists share, trying to reclaim the selfie. Those who post photos for Trans Day of Awareness, for example, or to highlight the violence in the favelas of Brazil. So we can say that social photography can provide a civic refuge. Ariella Azule says that, and I quote, "Photography at times is the only civic refuge at the disposal of those who are robbed of citizenship." And we might look, for example, at the Black Lives Matter movement as an example of that. Social photos can also support co-located photo work, sharing and display. Social practices of capturing, ordering and editing often surround these kinds of photos. Museums, of course, have very quickly cottoned on to the potential in all of that for that particular kind of context. Social photos can express and create self through everyday creativity. And that reference to everyday creativity there kind of connects this kind of practice with talk about the maker movement and DIY culture and all of those kinds of things that, of course, we are interested in the museum sector. Social photos can allow us to bear witness, perhaps to bear witness to events that we might not have been able to witness otherwise. And so here I'm thinking of the work that's being done to understand how migrant stories or the stories of refugees are being kind of relayed to us through social photography and social networks. And through those stories, of course, we have access to their experiences. We are able to witness them in a way that we wouldn't be able to if we were relying solely on the kinds of narratives and constructions that come through the mainstream press and media that surrounds those kinds of events. Also, we know that social photography can help to co-construct new kinds of intimacy. They can forge and explore new patterns of intimacy that, again, might be of interest to us in the museum sector. So what then also can social photography do within the museum's context? Well, there are a lot of claims about what social photography can do. And so here I kind of, reiterate some of those. So we hear that social photography can offer different stories and different truths, perhaps. It can allow us to pose new questions. It can inspire. It might inspire empathy, play, creativity, curiosity, any number of different kinds of action. It might lead to more or better social interaction. And again, I'm reminded here that these are possibilities. These are not inevitabilities of using this kind of stuff. They can help us to recurate, reinterpret, and revalue the archive, even recraft a museum's brand. Alli Burness, again, has written about that. Forge new ways of looking and also of placemaking. And they can be part of a live, cross-platform, multimedia conversation as well. So we're reminded of the relationship between a social photo and the digital superpublic, as it's been called. So photos outlive the place in which they're originally taken, viewed, and circulated. And that can be either a positive or negative thing, of course, for museums. And so here, I'll just briefly kind of put up there a photo that was taken within the Museum of Fine Art in Boston, which kind of seeks to pick up and connect with a broader debate about the politics of heritage, display, and participation. And so there are quite radical potentials here for social photography. But this is, of course, a challenging landscape for museums to navigate. And these images, I think it's worth noting, are not disembodied digital heritage encounters. And we quite often talk about digital encounters like they are in some way less physical or they're disembodied. And I think we kind of need to challenge that. These encounters, and we can see it here, are written on the body and they can create new meanings. Okay, so that then brings us to, let's not get carried away. That brings us then to maybe that question of, well, what can't social photos do then? What are the things that we might struggle with here? What might be the limitations of this kind of format? And so here I've got a number of provocations that I'm just going to end with. And these don't necessarily represent my own perspectives on these things, but I'm hoping that they might provide us maybe with some start points. So firstly then, Beyoncé is museum selfie. And here I'm kind of referring to that idea that not all social photography is created equally. We know, for example, that influencer selfies, as they're called in the kind of marketing speak, are much more anticipated than those of the average user of a service. And the simple truth is that they, in the museum's context as well, greater value might be placed on them as well, where they crop up. Instagram is not your community. Twitter is not ubiquitous. Social photography isn't a diverse and open conversation that anybody can take part in. Far from it. In these platforms, someone is always being excluded. Evidence shows us that digital exclusion is still a massive problem, a matter of education, age, race, gender, ability, and geography. And it's sobering that it's overwhelmingly those same people who are disenfranchised in the rest of society who are still disenfranchised online. And the session yesterday on the anti-oppressive online space, I think, was a really encouraging entry into that kind of a discussion. Anyone remember Facebook? So here I'm kind of thinking about that fact that we're using these spaces as ways of archiving and collecting. What happens then to the kind of accumulated archive that emerges in these kinds of spaces? Where, how, and in what format we archive social photos does remain a big question, and it has an ethical dimension as well, raising questions about data, the use of third-party sites, digital accessioning, and stewardship then over time. And we sometimes think about digital media as being a kind of an antithesis to loss and forgetting, but those kinds of claims need to be questioned because they are, of course, flawed. Swipe logic might be an emergent norm. In the digital environment, there's always potentially something more exciting on the next screen. We know that, right? Swipe logic might be here to stay, and if it is, what does that mean for how we engage? What can't a social photo do? Well, it sometimes can't operate outside of the literacies of the platforms where it originates and where it's shared. It might not translate from Snapchat to Twitter, for example. We were hearing earlier about ephemeral content. And it can't appeal to everyone. We don't all heart selfie time. There are instances, of course, where social photography, particularly the selfie, has been deemed problematic in the extreme for museums. And persistent bans on photography at some sites. I was at the Museum of Death yesterday, and I was very upset not to be able to take a museum selfie of myself in the Museum of Death. Bans on selfie sticks, of course, also indicate that the kinds of performance that are now being ritualized in the selfie are unwelcome or inappropriate in certain hallowed museum contexts. If you have a conservative photography policy, you should be damn sure why, because social photography, of course, makes it laughable. That all sounds a bit gloomy. Here we are going to be celebrating, I think, social photography and the noisy, playful, sometimes incoherent digital publics that they give us access to. And at this stage, I'm going to hand over to Chad, who's going to talk a bit about how all of that kind of refracts in his own practice.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jenny. And thank you, Alli, for inviting me to be a part of this panel. I am an independent museum technologist, and I'm fascinated by these issues from a technologist standpoint. I have not yet visited the Museum of Death, but this is my black slide of death. This is where I talk about death, and the museum as mausoleum. This is where collection objects that have lived rich and influential lives, coursing through culture, come to a final rest, where we only talk about their past lives before they were accessioned, and we disregard their current power. Sorry. And this is the slide of collections alive. Digital affords every collection object a new life, available, findable, surfaced by storytelling and connections. Now we can trace the activity of collections objects as they circulate through digital ecosystems. From gallery walls, through visitors' lenses onto servers and over networks, we can see their traces when they're tagged, geolocated, or matched by computer vision algorithms. Our collections are not dead. They are alive, and not just on the walls of the galleries. They are now coursing through networks, used, reused, commented on, liked, shared, incorporated by audiences. They are alive like never before. Social media managers can sense trends. They know who's noticing what, where, what's catching people's attention, what are the outliers, and this is important. It's begging for a typology, as you'll see. Social media managers can find them by tag or location, collect them, sort them, share them, put them on their walls, and save them. What they reveal as individual images is charming, sometimes funny, poignant. What they reveal in aggregate is important. They are traces of life, of collection objects being used, singled out, marked, and connected to people, connected to life. A social media manager knows these trends, quirks, attachments, senses the life of the galleries and the collection, seen through the eyes of visitors. It shouldn't stop there. The institution should leverage that knowledge to better connect with audiences, as Megan will show us. We need to save the stories around our collection objects. This means connecting things like Instagram posts to our collections, making note of how visitors, teachers, professors, artists, designers, and others are using collection objects. This is a mock-up we call Collection Connector, Imagine a social media manager finds a visitor pic on Instagram. Click, and a bookmarklet appears, asking you to relate the image to the collection. Save, and the image is connected to the collection. This is just one part of a museum technologist's dream, making mission statements into operating systems. Many museum mission statements include language that connects people to collections. A true museum content management system would connect people, a CRM on the left, to collections, a collections management system on the right. In the middle are all the different bits of content, from within and without, that connect people to collections. An Instagram post is one.
Instagram means me. Hi, I'm Megan. I am the social media manager at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., and I'm really here as the social media perspective. And it's strange because I think I'll transition a little bit into what Alli's talking about too, and also say a lot of the things that Jenny and Chad said. So it's really nice to hear us all talking to each other. Yeah, it's great. I hope so. So what I want to start out with is just this idea that objects are powerful, and we know this as museum professionals, that you can have an experience with an object. So say you're a visitor, you go to a place and you're doing a thing with an object, you're experiencing it, you're connecting with it, you're transported by it. Hopefully, that's the goal. It's a special thing that happens, but we know that it happens. But what next? It's sort of the next layer. This experience can happen in a variety of ways. Jenny said taking a photograph in the museum and posting it to social is just a new type of meaning making. I know we often think it's a little silly. I've made fun of people taking pictures all the time, but it's something that we're seeing as full of meaning. So similarly, as technologists, how do we react? We can use our visitors as teachers, just the way our visitors are using objects as teachers. Just like Chad said, our collections are circulating online. I see them living on social media every single day. My goal is to build on those interpretations that our visitors are having. One thing I really want to mention is that this is a goal, this is a dream, this is sort of my pipe dream. This doesn't necessarily happen right now, but it's really important to just understand that it can happen. To build on moments, to build on relationships between object and visitor and institution, visitor and experience, that's very hard. And if any of you are doing it, then tell me more. But this is what I would love to see happen. So these are some questions that I'm really curious about. A photograph is a solid, tangible piece of evidence that shows there is a moment of connection. And a social media manager can visually see that our visitors are connecting every single day. One of my favorite social media managers, who I won't say by name, calls us the original stalkers. And it's true, we're constantly listening, we're constantly watching what our visitors are doing. I want us to get beyond listening. And what I'm really curious about is what our response is, what our goal is behind responding to our visitors, and does that actually matter? So it's easy to do what we do now. It's easy to prompt looking and engagement with the collection. That's what we do. We drive experiences by asking questions. This is what I do. You can see if I notice that there are a bunch of people flocking around one picture, I'm probably pretty sure that picture is going to show up on social media a couple of hours later. And I'm going to reshare that because I know that that's an experience that someone has had, and I want to capitalize on that moment. I'm not talking about anything radical here. I know that everyone is already doing this. What I really want to talk about is asking questions, resharing moments. So what I'd like to debunk is the myth that social media is separate from teaching, from museum education. And I'm a museum educator, so this probably comes pretty easily to me to say. But we often say that social media is traditionally or usually a tool for marketing, PR, promotion. I know that that's where a lot of our social media managers live, in museums. We keep it separate from teaching our audiences something new. But really, inherently, what we're doing online is making deeper connections. We're offering moments for our visitors to connect. The reality is that social media is museum education. We're offering guiding questions, we're offering prompts, asking people to look deeply. And so what's the point? Ryan Dodge talked about this earlier this morning. It's about making us more human as institutions. It's about opening up space for emotion. If I publish a photo with a question based off of someone else's photo, then can I encourage a chain reaction of events there? There's so much potential. Can I establish a trend for everyone to go take an image of one piece of architecture and then get someone to look at something differently? It can help us alter what we say and do on social media so that we can become more aware, more human, more personal, and more real. So I'm constantly learning, I'm constantly resharing and asking questions of our audience, and this is me as a museum educator, just thinking about what might stop you in the museum and make you look carefully. Oftentimes we just say, here's a picture that we found, and we're resharing that. I'm getting ideas from our audience, they're getting ideas from me, then they're in turn providing content for me, and it's a cycle. It's really a win-win. But then my question is, what's beyond that? How do we actually continue to provoke that conversation and get a little bit deeper?
Okay, so I'm Alli Burness. I'm talking about a project that I was part of at the Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences in Sydney, or the Powerhouse Museum. And I'm talking unusually from the museum educator slot on this diagram. I'm usually in digital media with a bit of data analysis in there, so I think that's the value that I brought to this next project. This project extends on Chad's idea that we can trace the activity of collection objects as they circulate through digital ecosystems. And I really liked his idea of photos that were begging for a typology, because this is what this project is reaching towards. And Megan's idea that we can learn from our visitors as visitors are teachers to us. I need to give a big shout out to my researchers in crime, being Kylie Budge, the manager of research at the Powerhouse Museum, and Jim Fishwick, who's also a museum educator, improv extraordinaire, and generally very amazing person. And I'll first talk about the inspirations for this project. In the middle of last year, the debate around social media photographs in museums and their validity as genuine museum engagement raised its head again, with the director of a major Sydney institution stating that they were superficial, that they were not really engagement. And not long after, I was at MCN last year, and Alyssa Frankel tweeted this: "Why does engagement bug us so much? One reason is it's all about what the museum wants, not visitors' goals." So Jim, Kylie and I thought we'd look at the data. Let's look at the images as a data set and see what they're actually saying to us. We wanted to understand what engagement with museum objects means from the perspective of visitors, and we wanted to know how visitors engage with objects using social media. So in overall, we harvested a set of Instagram images taken at a particular museum. We analysed their images and their captions through 2 different methods, and we discovered a spectrum of different ways that visitors engage with objects using social photography. And the images that we harvested are here shown on Tumblr. They were posted to a geotag at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Sydney, and we chose that site because we saw the rate at which that geotag was being used, and we knew we could generate a data set quite quickly. And in 7 days, we collected 380 images, and this was meant to be a test data set. We wanted to work with a larger data set, but not long after we did this, Instagram changed its API and we could no longer semi-automatically collect these images as a data set. And so that's changed our plans for the next steps in our research. So, of course, Tumblr didn't easily let us sort the images. We wanted to put them into groups that organically emerged from the data set. So we printed out every single image, and the walls of Kylie's office became like a visual data analysis lab. And the first time we sorted them, we applied a visual research method. And so that means we focused on analysing the images themselves primarily, and we did this to address a gap in discourse analysis identified by Gillian Rose. And she has argued that audiences have been a neglected aspect of visual research, that the visitor's eye has been mostly absent from discourse analysis. And we wanted to bring the visitor's eye into the centre of this project and let it determine what our findings were. So images broke themselves into relatively simple high-level categories. They focused on objects as a majority, just under 50%. But of course, if you look at categories that feature people, that makes up a similar amount, which underlines that the importance of the social element of a museum visit. But we wanted more nuanced and meaningful categories. So we paired our visual analysis with a linguistic analysis, and that meant that we focused on which aspect of the image was emphasised in the caption. And so we sorted them all again and used a different wall and sorted them all again by looking at the image, reading the caption and saying, well, what in the caption is it? What is the caption highlighting in the image? And from that process, we found these emergent categories which spoke much more to the motivations for taking these images. They indicated a range of reasons for engaging. And here I have them sorted from the smallest categories to the largest. And you'll see that self-love or self-portraiture or selfies was the smallest category. And we had creative response as well. We felt that this was the sweet spot, and this was where the visitor became the museum and the museum became the visitor, where the goals of the visitor and the influences they brought was equally in harmony with what the museum was offering at that time on that day. And so both influences were in balance. So also we found that these categories overlapped significantly. They weren't mutually exclusive, which the first sort felt it was. And so we thought, well, they must be related. They can be arranged into perhaps a spectrum. And so this diagram is our early sketch to sort of to bring them into a relationship. And we have at the centre creative response. This diagram suggests that there's a depth of engagement, that there's a particular category that we prefer. And we didn't like that imposition of values on what the data set was saying. So we ended up with this diagram instead. And so to unpack it a bit, on your left-hand side, we have the types of influences that visitors bring when they visit a museum. So at the top, they're arranged from those fleeting influences. So a visitor's personal objects, their presence with a museum object. That's a very short period of time in a visitor's life. Down to those prolonged influences, embodied knowledge, their cultural background, formal and informal education, moving through and being brought by the museum visitor into the building or into relationship with a museum object, and that experience being expressed, in this case, through social media photography. And we have the categories that came from our second sort listed down the right-hand side. And the darkest in the middle being creative response, where those two influences we felt equal. And instead of ordering these categories here from, oh, this is what we feel is a sort of a shallower form of engagement to a deeper form of engagement, we've arranged them at top with the categories that are visitor-centric. So those images that really focus on a social happening or a selfie, all the way down to the bottom, which are object centric. And there were many images that just took a photograph of an object, and if there was text on that object, that is what the caption said. It was completely focused and wholly consumed by the object. And so Kylie, Jim and I are all aware that this is just another engagement spectrum in a spectrum of engagement spectrums. But we really feel that ours is differentiated by the fact that it's an even playing field. We don't feel that we've imposed a sense of deeper engagement or shallower engagement categories, and that this spectrum could be applied by institutions to learn from visitors and use those learnings to be applied into programming rather than strategically creating content to push out to visitors. Perhaps it's an incoming learning spectrum. Okay, so that is the end of that project. So it's time, we have time for the panel to discuss and make connections between our little projects and presentations and ideas, and I think a ton have come up organically. One that the panel had been talking around a little bit was technology and its changing nature. And I mean, I know for our project, Instagram, changed its API, broke our project. And I'm really curious, just to kick us off, Chad, how that is influencing your work with, what was it called? The Collections Connector?
Connector.
Yeah.
I made that up. It's a problem. The API changed over the summer, and data archiving folks are having to work around it. There is progress being made. I can point you to a great toolkit put out by the North Carolina State University Libraries. I'll tweet out a link to it. It has a great roundup of archiving tools for libraries, governments, museums, cultural heritage as well. That includes Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, etc. And from a technology standpoint, that means that we'll have tools that we can harvest data and run them through an algorithm, perhaps, computer vision, that sort of thing, and start to connect them to collections, perhaps in a more automatic way, which I think would be really interesting as well.
Yeah, I was just wondering, when you talk about the picture that you showed where you had all those different kinds of interaction down the middle there, and then the content management system, and then you had your users on the left. I wonder if there's also a way of envisaging how all of those bits in the middle might kind of speak to each other as well, and whether you've kind of been looking at that at all, so how the Instagram bit might also speak to the school programs or whatever else, in what might become a much more complicated and less attractive image of that kind of engagement, I guess.
Right. That's a fascinating idea, and I don't know if my emojis will stretch that far. But no, I love the idea of that sort of nested data presentation, and that's the sort of representation that we'll need. And we're just, in terms of the frameworks we're looking at, we'll be able to represent data in that flexible way, I think. And the end point of that is in some ways unknown. And I think that's important to say from the get-go. It's clear that these photos, these visitor representations, are hugely important in so many ways, that as Jenny was telling us. And it's important that we know from a big picture level that there may be an aggregate story among them that we don't even see right now, but that we would never see if we did not collect them and start collecting them now. And so even, we think about museums collecting objects, certainly. This is just another way of thinking about museums collecting stories, or even little bits that might later become stories. I think that's important.
We'll throw it open to the audience in just a second, but I have one burning question from Megan. Jenny was talking about the predominance of swipe logic, and it just seems to be growing bigger and bigger, and I know that what you talked about today, feeds often talk about encouraging museum audiences to slow down online and use social media photography for that purpose. And I wonder, how does it feel working in that space, that tension between the predominance of swipe logic that's getting faster and faster and what your goals are?
It's very hard. I don't think there's a good answer for this because the issue is that, again, as an educator, you can ask a question or you can prompt someone to take 5 minutes or 10 minutes or 30 seconds even to look at a work of art and to let your eye wander over it, but I don't know what that person is actually doing with that work of art and what their response will be if it's online and I'm not standing with them in a gallery space. So I can teach someone, and I could teach all of you right now to look at a work of art and we could have a slow looking experience, and I can watch all of you and I can know what you're doing. But if again, stalking, but if I tweet that and I have no idea what's happening on the other end, then it's the same thing as the swipe logic situation, because then I can just assume that there might be 3 people who decide I'm going to take 5 minutes and I'm going to look at this work of art and I'm really going to answer her question. And so what we've really tried to do at the National Gallery is incorporate these ideas of slowing down and looking carefully into every post that we put on social media. So if you see our tweets and our Facebook posts and our Instagram posts, we're generally going to be asking questions. And it's generally going to be open-ended to get you to think about what we're talking about, whether it's contextual information about the work of art or asking you to connect in some way. Now, do I get people actually answering those questions? 9 times out of 10, no. But there are moments that I see where we get really rich responses, and so I know that it works. But it's just not, it's so hard to counteract I'm scrolling through my Instagram, I really love this picture, I'm going to double tap it, and that's all I'm going to get. So it's a double-edged sword.
And go. No, you go.
I was just going to say that it seems that there is that kind of broader slow movement going on, and I had wondered how that translates into the museum environment, and you've just given us a nice example of what it looks like kind of in situ. So we've got slow journalism, slow food, all of that. And now I'm wondering if there is such a thing, and you can tell me, as slow museums practice and what that might look like also, and whether there are opportunities for slowing down our practice also.
Yeah,
Oh, sorry.
you want to go?
No, go ahead.
Okay. Absolutely. At my previous position, we worked on different types of contemplative programming in the museum, and that was something that was really important to us. We do the same thing at the National Gallery. There are all types of programs. I was talking to Gavin about this the other day, about him and his staff just taking minutes to think and slow down and look at objects before actually working. It's so interesting to me, and that's why that was actually my talk at Museums on the Web, was thinking about how we can just give ourselves more space to look before we do anything. And I think the same thing can happen in a museum setting that does happen in a museum setting if you're on a gallery talk with an educator, where they ask you to take 30 seconds to look at a work of art before you start talking about it or before they start sharing about the artist or the context. That can also happen online. It's just how you frame it. And I don't know the answer. I don't know how to frame it well in order to get people to do it, but I think it can happen.
I think, too, that's a really good opportunity to talk about platforms just a little bit. I think Instagram is particularly suited to the sort of inquiry-based learning that you're talking about and that the gallery does so well. If for no other reason than that the image is always attached to those comments. In Twitter, it's running away from you, and you lose track of the visual. But on Instagram, the visual is always there. And in the last couple of months, too, it's not only always there, but you can zoom in. And that's important.
Yeah.
Okay, we are at time, but I would love to take some questions from the audience if there are any. Seema.
I loved the presentation, and Alli, I wanted to look at your slide with your data. A question I have for having presented to maybe half of you previously is that you're talking about things that people create without us. It sounds like things that you found, and I wonder if it was the one that had your research that had visitor-centered to object-centered. It'd be interesting to me, and what do you think this would look like for a project that the museum initiated, like Chad's project in North Carolina, or a project I haven't done a ton of. How would it be different, or would it be the same?
Can I clarify the question? Are you asking if perhaps these categories might be different depending on the exhibition or a different museum?
Yeah, like if for an exhibition you said Instagram, if you gave them a thought question, or Chad had a project that I won't recognize because it's in the panel. But like if when the institution steps into creativity, does this look different? Like you have a different rundown of the categories? Do you have more?
Okay, so the question was about the influence of the museum stepping into the conversation and how much that might change the categories. Absolutely, and I think some of the key questions in the next steps of our research was about, it can be the museum stepping into the conversation online, but it can also be about the curatorial vision of an exhibition and how much that might shape the response of social media photography as well. And there was a solo exhibition, a huge retrospective solo exhibition at the museum that we took this data for at the time. And just by some strange coincidence, his work spoke with words to social media language now. Ha ha ha. Lol, and it just seemed to connect. He'd created those works decades earlier, but he was really emphasising that part of his work in his retrospective, and I think it really did shape this data set. So, as I said, there was only 380 images in this, and I think I would love to roll out this methodology and this sorting process, this coding process, on a larger data set, and there are people who are able to do that. Maria Paula Arias, who's also out there on Twitter at the moment in Doha, did do that with about 4,000 images from a museum in Doha. So it's worth talking to her about her work as well. Coleman.
Give us an example of a creative response that you used as, you found 22, or the category is 22 on the previous slide. What are the qualifications of one of your data pieces being
Yes.
categorized as a creative response? Yeah.
Yes. Can I take that on notice, and I will dig one up and send one to you? Absolutely. I will. Yeah, I will. Absolutely. It has.
It's difficult to categorize these into these strict
And
categories. Everything is in the diagram.
Exactly. Particularly these categories, and it was a matter of interpretation. I'm trying, and it was 6 months ago that we did this initial sort. So I will send out some examples.
Thanks.
Excellent. All right, we are definitely. Oh, Ryan, let's take one more.
I just wanted to add, we use a software as a service to collect photos from visitors. We've been doing it since last September 2015. We have over 100,000 photos from visitors. So I'd love to connect with you and do some of that, like look at that data set.
That's fabulous. That would be brilliant.
Have you got a big enough wall?
Yeah, well, we'll have to find a wall that's big enough, but yes.
Just about the stopping and looking thing that Megan answered as well, I think that's really important. A lot of people you see going around the museum and they're just like this, and they're not actually really looking at stuff, they're just snapping photos.
Yep.
And I think as museum social media people as a whole, we really need to encourage people to take a step back from their devices for a minute and really think about what they're looking at first and try to engage more in that. So I was really happy to hear that. But let's connect about that, all those images. Great.
It also, I'm glad, thank you for saying that. It makes me think, we were having a conversation about this in the International Museum Social Media Managers Facebook group the other day, about wall labels and floor labels and how we get people to look. And I think Abraham Ritchie was the one who was sharing all of his amazing examples of text on the walls next to works of art that said, respond to this in X creative way, here's the hashtag. And like, go you. And like that is the way, in my mind, it's one way that we can actually get people to do something instead of just saying, here's the hashtag, but let's let them do something, yeah.
So yeah, just to follow on that, we have a Jubilee exhibit right now. It opened in June and visitors have shared 12,000 photos.
Yeah, it's amazing.
That's great.
But what is it? Right.
What, are they learning anything?
Right.
Or, yeah.
Right, yeah, what's the impact of it and what does it actually mean? And I think that's what I'm really interested in, is that we can see all hundreds of thousands of photos of people going to museums. So cool, great, they're going. But, what is the next step and how do we actually foster some deeper type of engagement or some deeper line of questioning beyond just saying share your experience, which is a great thing to ask, but there has to be more.
I was just going to add that there might be some methodologies that we can employ from, say, journalism studies, where people are trying to make sense of citizen journalism and, responses to crisis and things like that, that can help to, inform and even maybe mechanize some of the processes that you're doing in ways that don't do a disservice then to the content of the images. But I'd need to kind of look those out.
And I've just been reminded by Megan that we have about 10 more minutes, which is wonderful. That means I can just talk to some next steps, actually, which is very relevant, the next steps to our research process. And I had really wanted to have an interview stage with the creators of these images. We can read motivations into captions and images, and to a degree there might be some accuracy, but I really would like to pair this up with some qualitative data and close that circle and clarify those motivations and really determine, yes, what are they doing? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. I just wanted to talk to Jenny's point about branding and social media imagery effectively reframing, creating a museum brand. And my concept around this has been that not only are visitors performing themselves and their own visit at the museum, but they are in so doing creating the museum, performing the museum and thereby creating the museum. I wonder what your response to that was.
No, and I think that's absolutely the case, and of course that can be a positive thing, or you might conceive of it as a negative thing, depending on what people are saying about your institution as brand. But I absolutely think that is out there and it's happening, and it's difficult to control. So the best thing is to be involved in that conversation, right? And to be keeping an eye on what people are saying about your brand. And I did a bit of research before on 25 institutions and how they were using social media spaces. And this was a couple of years ago. And the findings were not very surprising, that museums were mostly using social media spaces to push marketing messages, and very often at that stage they weren't responding even to points of criticism that were coming through on their Facebook pages or whatever else, and that was just so disheartening to see. And I think probably things have changed in the last couple of years, but yeah, I mean, you've just got to be there and keeping an eye on what's happening, with a view to being involved in a conversation.
Megan, do you feel that social media images created by visitors has at all had an impact on the NGA brand and what the NGA thinks of itself?
Yes, I do. We were not re-sharing images from visitors until about a year ago. And so we actually, this is very new for us to really start to think of ourselves as visitor-centered, perhaps. It's like this. I realize is a small step to reshare a visitor image and engage in that way. Doesn't necessarily mean visitor-centered, but it's a way to obviously start to bring our audiences more into the picture. And that was our title of our session. But yes, I think that what my colleagues and I have really tried to think about is how can we begin to make our museum a little bit more human? And I think obviously that's what all of us are talking about here is what does it look like for a large institution to have this personal side? And for me, that is really bringing the community into our accounts and making them feel like they're welcome. So by resharing an image, that's 100% completely different than just putting up JPEGs of works of art. I mean, that's an automatic change.
I know there was a couple of questions popping up. Coleman, do you want to go first?
So, in this process of reframing the museum as a visitor to the audience's perception of the museum, and Megan, this is really for you and your colleagues in the International Museum of Social Media Managers.
They're all here.
Yeah, so they're all here. How does that metastasize into National Gallery of Art is now considered an audience member of, Smithsonian Bare Space or of an international museum? Do you, as an institutional persona, engage as an audience member on their pages?
That's a great question.
Yeah, my head's just gone.
Yeah, can you reframe this entire discussion that we've had of audience as visitor, visitor as museum?
Right, so does the museum become an audience member with another institution? Yes.
As an even more inclusive dialogue, I feel better because I can contribute to this museum because that museum contributed to this museum.
Yes.
And then I'm on the same page. That museum is my colleague.
Right.
Rather than being a triangle.
Right, of hierarchy. Yeah. Yes. Done. No. So I won't start with me. A great example of this was actually in an earlier presentation with the Broad, the Whitney, and the NSF MoMA, but the Broad was talking about the SoCal art museums, and is Ariel here? Yeah. And so the Hammer and the Getty and whatever other museums are in Southern California all supported the Broad before they opened. So there were a lot of messages that went out about the reopening, images shared, et cetera, et cetera. So another great, Russell could talk about the museum InstaSwap that happened originally in London before it expanded around the world. So I think there are really good instances of museums using each other as collaborators and ways to share information. And I hadn't really thought of it as me as visitor, or as audience member to Smithsonian American Art Museum instead of like that hierarchical thing. But for what's interesting to think about now that I've actually said all those examples is that I'm wondering if museums keep it city specific, or if we're so, we know our colleagues in each of our cities, so I'm going to know that I could work with the Smithsonian, or I know that I could work with the Phillips Collection because they're institutions in DC, but should I actually reach out to the Blanton, which is in Texas, and do something with them? So just naming all the people that are in the front row. So it's a really good point.
It's like a theoretical position of climbing down the ladder.
Yep. Yeah.
Can I just say a couple of things on that? So yeah, last year we did a museum InstaSwap, which was in 10 museums in London we split into pairs, and we each pair visited each other and took photos of that museum through their own sort of themes and perspectives. We're doing a second one, hopefully the end of this year or early next year, where it'll be different when we all meet at one museum together. And we will do a tour of museums in London in one day, taking photographs of these other places. So my museum will be photographing stuff at the Natural History Museum and at the Tate and wherever else.
Wow, that's awesome.
So that should be really fun.
Yeah,
but also
it's
this
incredible.
kind of culture, especially in London, and I hope it's everywhere, where we have private sort of views for each other. We'll visit each other, and we'll go to the Royal Academy, and I'll be walking around there with members just like us now, social media managers of museums, and we will then take photos of their art and of their work, but then tweet them or Instagram them from our own institutions, and it feels really fun and organic. And it's like, we had sexology on, so I was looking for like a sexually explicit photo I could share with our audiences, and then my colleague was looking for a dog, because they have lots of little animals, and it feels fun and it's organic, and I think audiences really like to see institutions that they're fans of being fans of each other and having that exchange as well.
Yeah, another example that now comes to mind is the National Museum of African American History and Culture that just opened. Our colleague there invited everyone from around the city to participate in her preview day, so that museums from DC were spreading the word and coming at it from their institutional perspective. So it was really neat from the National Gallery's perspective to be there talking about our new neighbor down the mall. And that's, it's something that's really important for us to have that and to share that. So yeah, I think it's a really good point.
Okay, we're now definitely at time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.